Good afternoon and welcome to this conference. I know you already had one session, but we didn't have a formal introduction, so I just wanted to take 1 or 2 minutes talking about the Elfenberg Center, which is sponsoring this conference. So I'm the director of the center, Elfenberg Center for Responsible Business. It was launched 2 years ago, and in its previous incarnation, it was focused on corporate governance. But we expanded that 2 years ago to include issues related to environmental, social issues such as poverty and what businesses can do about that. So last year we had a conference on business and the challenges of inequality. And this year, Dr. Ali approached me and asked if we could do something on healthcare. And obviously being the Elfenberg Center for Responsible Business needed to have a business angle. So we brainstormed, there was a planning committee of several faculty and Dr. Ali, and we came up with what can we do, how can we improve healthcare, and so that there is justice for all. So that was the theme for the conference. And now let me introduce Dr. Ali. He's the moderator, and we have 3 panelists, Dr. Sanjeev Redkar, Dr. Geeta Rao, and Dr. Paul Song. They are all doctors here. Some of them are PhD doctors and some of them are physician doctors, but doctors nevertheless. So a brief introduction of Dr. Ali. He is our physician and director of the Health and Wellness Center at St. Mary's. We call him Dr. Ali. Technically, I suppose I should call him Dr. Rezapour. He's a graduate of the American University of the Caribbean Medical School, and he completed his residency training in internal medicine at UCSF Fresno. And he has been in private practice for 12 years, and he joined St. Mary's after that. His passion lies in social justice issues, and one indicator is he is at St. Mary's, so he's not going to get the big bucks that physicians typically get paid. So he has given numerous presentations, participated in public debates, has given a grand rounds lecture on this topic. And he's been a member of the Physicians for a National Health Program and is recipient of the Way of Peace Award from the Fresno Center for Nonviolence in 2008. So Dr. Ali will introduce the panelists briefly and take it from here.
Thank you so much, Saroja. I also want to thank the SIBO School of Business and Economics, as well as the Elfenberg Center for Responsible Business. Really, there was a sense of a gap where, how can a business make a successful business without making a killing? Because when a business makes a killing, some people die. And when it comes to healthcare, these are our patients that we see. And so the theme of this conference was about how do we strike that balance where innovation and resources are coming together to elevate humanity and to bring new creativity for the society in general, and yet have these businesses also be successful. Can business make a living? Is access to healthcare something like a commodity that should be worked upon by the forces of market, the supply and demand, giving the cost, and whoever can afford it be able to pay for it, and whoever cannot afford it not be able to access it? Or is it a human rights issue? That's where our platform started, and we brought together a group of panelists from multiple different perspectives, and we hope that you all participate in the conversation as well. We have structured it so that each panelist will give a 10-15 minute presentation, and then we will have question and answer both from the audience and from one another. So the first presenter is going to be Dr. Sanjeev Redkar. He's the president and CEO of CBT Pharmaceuticals, a startup biotech company that is developing novel drugs for cancer. In his previous role, Dr. Redkar was a senior vice president of product development at Aztecs Pharmaceuticals, as well as Otsuka company responsible for pharmaceutical development, technical operation, and manufacturing. Dr. Redkar has also been closely involved in preclinical and clinical trials and approval of medications. Dr. Redkar is a co-inventor of guanacine, sorry about that, guanacine, a novel hypomethylating agent now in phase 3 of clinical trials. For 20 years in oncology drug development experience, he has several peer-reviewed publications and patents. Dr. Redkar earned his doctorate degree from University of Colorado in Boulder, an MBA from St. Mary's College of California. It's good to have you back on campus, and did his undergraduate degree in Indian Institute of Technology in Bombay. Dr. Redkar is an adjunct faculty and a board member of University of Pacific Pharmacy School at Stockton. Dr. Redkar, the table is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ali, for the kind introduction. I'm humbled. I feel like a lamb in a slaughterhouse or something like that, presenting this topic. Dr. Ali and Saroja, they gave this topic perspective on pharma pricing. It's quite interesting how the pharmaceutical industry is perceived, and that's why I called it just a perspective. I was going in the plane once, and a guy sitting next to me said that when I told him I was working for an oncology drug company, that hey, you guys have a cure for cancer, you're just not making it. And I was absolutely aghast. I mean, I worked 25 years for one purpose, to get good drugs on the market. And yes, there's a lot to blame in the pharmaceutical industry. But to even have such a perspective was just mind-boggling for me as a simple research scientist. So today, I have a few slides. It's just a perspective, and we will have a great discussion. So let me go, we've talked about this quite a bit. We spend, US as a country, we spend a lot on healthcare. That is given, and it has risen over the past 27 years. Right now at 17% of GDP. But what is very interesting is GDP has increased from $5 trillion around $5 or $3 trillion in 1980 to 17 now. So what you're looking at is we were spending close to 350 billion in 1980. Now we are spending close to 2.5 trillion. So this really doesn't do justice in what we are really spending. We are spending a far more because our GDP also increased over these years. So clearly this is well known. We know that we spend a lot of a percentage of GDP on healthcare, US, in comparison to other countries, Western countries, European countries, which hover around 8 to 10%. I was trying to say, where does this healthcare spending go? I come from the pharmaceutical industry, so just to put it in perspective, about 9% of our healthcare spending goes to drugs. About 30% goes into hospital care, and this was discussed by Dr. Song and Dr. Rezapour on insurance, and at the end of caregiving is also where a lot of the money is being spent. 20% is in physician and clinical services. So the drugs are about 9%, about 10% of the total healthcare costs, so 1.7% of the GDP. Let's see, we talk about, in the news, we hear a lot about drug price increases, and one particular drug is blown and it comes in media and we hear it. But there is something called the drug price index that is published, and it is very clear that this is the average wholesale price, that's the price of drugs. This is the index that is plotted from 2013 through 2015, and it has gone up 10% each year. So clearly there is an issue, and that's why we are here discussing it. But in this drug price index, there are three types of drugs. One is, of course, the brand drugs, which these are medicines that have exclusivity and the pharmaceutical companies can charge a premium. And then there are generic drugs, which post-exclusivity, they're priced. And as you can see, the brand drugs at the bottom, the increase year over year was almost 15%. So that is where the maximum price increase is going to. The generic drugs, which is, that program has actually succeeded from a regulatory perspective, range around 3% increase year over year. Prescription drugs. Oh, this repeats. Several other countries, UK has an organization called NICE, N-I-C-E. It's a center for excellence for drugs, and as soon as a drug is approved, they will actually do the analysis and make a recommend. This is a private enterprise, but they will recommend to the MHRA, which is a legal authority, whether it is worth covering the drug or not. We, US, to foster innovation, don't have that process yet. And that is primarily the reason why the price difference is there. I also am touchy about consumer advertising of prescription drugs. I don't know when late in the night when I see a Lunesta advertisement or something, and a butterfly flies and then sleeps, the visual element of it feels unfair. And what is very interesting is I work globally. I ask people, do you have consumer advertising of prescription drugs? And they said, no. No country has it. We have decided to have it. And my theory is, United States government is happy because, you have more drug costs, you get more tax, and the, GDP rises, the velocity of money. Everybody wins, except the consumer. So it's not just pricing of drugs. There is a bigger picture here. That's all my point is I want to make as a perspective. There's a lot of amount that is paid out of the pocket, and you decide which medication you want depending on the financial situation. This kind of triangular situation is where it causes the problem. And I was looking at, what I want to say on the right side picture is, it is so complex. On the right picture, what it shows is the product flow. So even the monies that you see, like say, we hear that, oh, Gilead is charging $85,000 for the treatment of HCV, hepatitis C, their bill. The thing is, they don't get $85,000. There's a lot of rebates that go on between manufacturers, pharmacy benefit managers, which decide which bill they get. So it is quite complicated. Well, recently we had a Congress, we had discussed about why this is happening. How can we address drug price increases? And of course, everybody knows about the issue that happened with Turing Pharmaceuticals as well as Valiant. Now Congress is spending time and they're talking some very, very interesting things that could have far-reaching effect. They're talking things like poison pill. If they see an increase which is too high, an exclusivity will be lost. The pharmaceutical manufacturer will lose their exclusivity if the price increases. So for the first time, government is discussing this, which is good, because even though I'm from the pharmaceutical industry, as Dr. Ezapur said, that there is a healthy way to grow your business. Get good drugs with substantial impact over the current drugs approved, and absolutely there'll be innovation and there'll be room for it. But incremental drugs getting approved may not be the path for the future, and that is how it should be. FDA is also looking at the generic drug approval process as a way to reduce healthcare costs. There's a lot of talk about value-based pricing, but the difficulty with that is value is in the eye of the beholder. For a manufacturer, the value could be I need to be first one in the market, whereas for the patient it could be affordable co-pays, what is the lifestyle change after taking the drug. It is not very easy value-based pricing, but at least it is being discussed and maybe in some of therapeutic areas it has a potential of application in some therapeutic areas. That's primarily what I have. These were points for later discussion, and I will hand it over to Dr. Ezapur.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the data that you shared with us, and we'll go back and forth in looking at that data as well.
Thank you. I'm glad you're clapping before I have anything to say, but Sanjeev was kind enough to share his slides, so I'm leveraging very heavily on what he said and using up my time to build on what he talked about. When Saroja first invited me to talk at this panel, we brainstormed a few topics, and she was telling me that the genesis of the conference was, both an interest in healthcare and an interest in business. So I thought I would focus a little bit more on the business of healthcare, and not so much from individual players, but because you've heard a lot about that both this morning and just recently, but also about the whole. Let's step back and take a look at the ecosystem and talk about some big picture drivers there. So just in case there were some non-business folks here, I thought I would just quickly address what's the notion of a value chain. And the notion of a value chain is something that Michael Porter at Harvard Business School came up with a couple of decades ago. And the idea is that if you look at all the stakeholders in an economy, and as they are passing goods and services among them, each player adds some value. So as the good or service goes from sort of the left to the right, you're adding more and more value to the customer. And then as you go, and then there's a converse notion of the supply chain, and because sometimes people get those confused, I thought I'd lay that out. So you have the supply chain coming together. Now, one of the things that Michael Porter said was that a true value chain is a collection of stakeholders that collaborate to optimize the benefit for the end user or the customer. And so it sort of seems like an oxymoron to think of a healthcare value chain, because everything you've heard tells you that no one's collaborating to support the patient, And that came home to me. So this was just a couple of examples of typical value chains, consumer, that's Apple's value chain on the top, and then data information value chain. So, you can pretty intuitively see that at each transaction over here, there is hopefully some kind of an open market, there's competition, people are bringing down costs, people are increasing quality or effectiveness, and as a result, by the time the value chain gets optimized, the customer is getting the best value for the kind of money that they're spending. So there was a well-researched report put together by the Wharton study called the Healthcare Value Chain, and I was very struck by this picture there. So let me ask a question. So they go from, on one end you have the payer, and then you have, which is the entity from which the money is actually spent, which could be the government for Medicare, the employer in case of employer-sponsored healthcare plans, and then the individual. You have the intermediaries who are aggregating the money, the HMOs, the insurers, and so on. You have then the hospital, and you have suppliers of, in this case, the distributors, and then at the far end you have what I would call the producers, I guess they call the producers too, pharmaceutical companies as well as medical technology companies, and so on. So what's missing in this value chain? Patients, physicians, very good. So we're missing two major players, but there's a reason we're missing that. To me, what this picture tells me is that if you do a straightforward analysis of the value chain, it is not meant to benefit the patient or the provider. I mean, we're just missing that in the way the industry works. And so just reprising what Sanjeev just talked about, this triad. So, when you talk about healthcare value, we think in terms of what we call the core triad. But the reality is that the payer and the provider don't talk to each other very well. There's lots of blinded negotiations that are going on. The provider and the patient never talk about the cost of care, rarely, if anything. And then the patient and the payer have a very, Byzantine conversation that's very convoluted. It's rarely direct, So the payer doesn't, clarify with the patient what they want to do, or that, there's no. So this so-called triad is a very, not a strong value chain, so to speak. And in fact, there are many, many other players in the healthcare ecosystem. So as a result, by the time those three conversations happen and you're going through all of the various participants, I'm going to go through this really quickly, you have a lot of complexity in the value chain. So the question is, what are the other factors? Why are all these players and how do they talk about it? So that, just the very fact that we have a triad instead of a chain, and the fact that we have other players is an issue. But on top of that, we have what I call the big three governors. And these are non-market forces that are active in the healthcare value chain. Okay? And each of them are equally important, or more important than the next, I would say. But they go beyond any other burden for any other kind of innovation, any other industry. So if you came out with a better mousetrap, they will beat a path to your door. If you came out with a better drug or medical devices, people won't even hear about it for a long time. So the first burden is the regulatory. It's a regulated industry. Of course, the FDA is front and center in everyone's consciousness. That's only part of the player. The FCC regulates, especially mobile and connected devices. The Federal Trade Commissions, those of you who heard about those, it's involved in marketing claims and label claims versus what the proven medical efficacy is. And of course, CMS also regulates the practice of medicine. So to the extent that we have standards of care, it's not very easy to disrupt any of that. So we have a big regulatory burden in this regulated care. And we can't get away from it, but it definitely adds to the complexity of the value chain. The second one, which you saw, since you had this wonderful picture about the pill and the money flow and the rebate flow, you can draw that kind of picture in a lot of different ways. So it's the way money flows in the healthcare industry is very complicated. And his picture looked complicated enough with just the pill, but imagine now a medical technology where, in addition to the players he had in his picture, we have the surgeon or the orthopedist who's going to use the technology, and the hospital that's going to stock the instrumentation or the devices. You have all these other players that get involved in that triad before any sale or any handoff in that value chain happens. So the reimbursement and the revenue models that are out there, including value-based payments, which, as you've alluded to briefly, is a new and emerging approach. They're all stymied by the state of the system right now. And then finally, let's not underestimate clinical adoption as a barrier. So or a governor. So you could have a device or a drug approved by the FDA. You could even have a reimbursement code for it, but there's no guarantee that a physician will either prescribe the drug or will use the device. Okay, and what is that? The governors over there are standards of practice, and the standards of practice they're not just the medical group from the AMA that's determining the standards of practice. It's the hospital infrastructure that's determining it. It's the HMO that's determining it. Sometimes it's the payer that's determining what treatment you can provide to a given patient. It's not Dr. Ellie and I were talking about it just before the panel. It's not just that a physician can make a medical judgment. There are many other factors. And clinicians as a class are therefore very, very conservative. They're exposed to malpractice. They're afraid to do anything out of the norm. It's very difficult to get innovation in. So you're looking at these three non-market governors on an already complex value chain. So navigating it can look like trying to find your way through a very complex maze. So this is sort of the state of the system. So is it all gloom and doom? What's going to change the business of healthcare? So the business of healthcare is complicated, lots of incumbent players, lots of dysfunction. What's going to change it? So I didn't want to leave it on a pessimistic note, so I have 3 factors I want to run by everybody. So the first is the market drivers. So it's a huge market, and you had a wonderful slide on how much money we're spending. Just the device market is $350 billion. Healthcare as a whole, the drug market is probably a bigger portion of that even. So there's a lot of money. The second is that many countries, especially the developed countries, we are going to have an aging population that's going to be a larger majority of the population very shortly. And we need the ability to, and as people age, they require more care, more health care. So the market for consumption of healthcare is growing, and therefore, hopefully, there's room for everyone to grow. If the pie is increasing, there's room to do things better. And finally, there's a shifting focus upstream from treatment to prevention. So these are the things that are going to help create innovation that's hopefully going to shift the way we provide healthcare. We can't use the traditional system where everybody goes to a doctor's office, spends half an hour in the waiting room, sees the doctor for 10 minutes, spends another 20 minutes with the checkout clerk, then goes to the pharmacy company. The burden, the toll that's on the consumer has got to go down from both sides. And people are also trying to put off that late stage increase in care more and more. Then we have behavioral drivers. These are a lot of consumer behaviors, self-monitoring. People are trying to take care of themselves. There are indeed care provision or care providers that are becoming more patient-centric. Certainly the vertically integrated providers like Geisinger or Kaiser in our own backyard. So there is definitely an improved, it changes behaviors in the physician. The way a physician at Kaiser has different incentives than a private practice physician. So we're looking at an increasing change. And finally, probably in my opinion, the biggest driver is going to be the high deductible plans. So if you don't mind sharing, how many people here have a high deductible plan? I'll say that as $1,500 and over deductible. Okay, just a couple. Okay, you must have good plans, yeah. Raise my hand. So, we now have deductibles as high as $6,500, and which means that a portion of your healthcare, the first part of your healthcare spend comes out of the consumer's own pocket. And this is definitely changing consumers' incentives. It's disrupting that triad. It's no longer, the payment structure is much more transparent now, and the patient wants to know. And it's creating opportunity for companies like Socialized where they can tell you, it's an app that will tell you, and your employers typically can subscribe to it, where if a patient needs a mammogram or needs an x-ray or something, or a colonoscopy, they can look up the relative costs of the providers, which was usually not transparent, but now you can find out that kind of information. So consumerization and self-pay is driving some better behavior in the value chain. And finally, my specialty, which is technology, I'm just going to put them all up and talk about it. So the three big ones, I'm just going to identify a couple, then many other areas. The first is connectivity. Anytime, anywhere connectivity from the consumer is changing how healthcare is being delivered, how healthcare is being priced. And that involves not just the care or the physiological aspects of care, but also the pricing. Secondly, big data and analytics, both on the financial side as well as the medical side, are changing. So now you're no longer experimenting with patients with very expensive specialty drugs, for example. You now can target the drugs, you can pick the drugs much better if you can do more precision medicine, and it's reducing the cost of care in general. The second big one is robotics. There is a lot of disintermediation that's happening in the care provision itself. And I, obviously have some dramatic pictures here. The one on the top is a robotic surgery device. The one on the bottom is a care, it's helping move heavy patients, in the hospital. It's a hospital, a robotic orderly in the hospital. And what that's doing is it's changing the cost equation. And the largest segment in Sanjeev's dollar bill was the provider, and it's bringing down provider costs by doing some of this. Now, I know those of you who are in the provider support environments are likely to be alarmed by something like this, but this is the progression of technology in some sense. And then finally, much more cheap ways of manufacturing products using technologies like 3D printing. That's Dr. Julie Lenoir, a good personal friend, and I like to have her picture up there. She had the first 3D printed medical supplies in space, where they can't afford to take everything, so they just take the filament and the printer, and they can, if somebody needs a tooth extracted, they build a dental tool, and they extract the tooth, and they recycle the product, the material. So you have similarly, it's a cast that's lighter, cheaper, and perfectly comfortable fitting. You have an orthopedic implant that's designed to, slip right around the existing spine, the discs, and then of course, soft tissue, cartilage tissue kind of implant. These are just some dramatic examples, but on a day-to-day basis, now you could take a finger splint that costs about $200 for a hand specialist to make, and can be printed out for 5 cents now. So you're seeing technology bringing down the cost of care in a way that's really dramatic. So I think the future of healthcare is one of an opportunity landscape. I'm not just saying it's good. I think there's an opportunity. I think things are pretty bad in some areas, but on the other hand, I think we have some cause to take action and take advantage of the drivers that we have here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pediatric and Family Medical Center. Dr. Song graduated with honors from the University of Chicago and received his medical degree from George Washington University. He completed his residency in radiation oncology at the University of Chicago and did brachytherapy fellowship at the Institute of Gustave Roussy in Villejuif, France. Did I say that right? Yeah. Song, it's yours.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to commend the first two talks, and I would love to see, wouldn't it be great if we had him running the FDA and her running the department? I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about sort of where I think our healthcare system is right now and where the limitations are and what we certainly can do better. You saw the slide earlier when Ali put this up. This was, oddly enough, Quentin Young, who was Martin Luther King's physician, just passed away about a month ago. He not only was Martin Luther King's physician, he was also Barack Obama's physician and ran the family medicine division at Cook County Hospital. He was a longtime advocate, but he actually passed away in Berkeley, where his daughter lives, about a month ago. But he was the one that actually was noted Martin Luther King's quote about, of all the forms of inequality and injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. This was delivered in 1966, so 50 years ago, and yet we still have too much injustice and inhumanity in our healthcare system. So when I graduated from medical school, which is now 25 years ago, C. Everett Koop was the Surgeon General, and he actually came and administered the Hippocratic Oath. And at the time, the part that I still remember is, I will follow that system of regimen which, according to my ability and judgment, I consider for the benefit of my patients, and abstain from whatever is deleterious and mischievous. Little did I know in the next 25 years that I would be involved in a system that was very deleterious to patients and very mischievous in terms of the for-profit motive. So just to point out that medical-related bankruptcies have increased 50% over the last 9 years. And in 2014, there were roughly 1.7 medical-related bankruptcies, of which 75% were roughly insured. And when people say, well, our system's great, I point out, how can this happen when you have insurance that you go bankrupt? So the debate that people always have regarding healthcare is it, should we do free market or should we do socialism? And I just want to point out, for those of you who remember Adam Smith and Lenin, this was Ronald Reagan. The term socialized medicine was actually coined by the American Medical Association in opposition to Medicare. And as I mentioned, this was a record he recorded that was given to the wives of physicians, that they were told to go have teas and disperse this and indoctrinate all your neighbors and about the evils of Medicare. But if you hear what he said is, if you don't stop Medicare and I don't do, one of these days you and I are going to spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was like in America when men were free. There goes that freedom in healthcare BS again. But here we are, 50 years later, and we haven't lost any freedom, and Medicare has actually been the most successful healthcare program that we have. So just to point out, we actually do have a socialized medicine system here in the United States. It's called the VA. Now, socialized medicine is where the government owns and operates every aspect of the healthcare system. They own the hospital, they employ the doctors, the nurses, the pharmacists, they own every piece of equipment in the hospital, the labs, the cafeteria workers. And the VA system is actually that system. And prior to the Iraq War, which I would say our government was grossly unprepared for in terms of the traumatic brain injury and things, the VA actually had the highest patient satisfaction of all healthcare systems in the US. It was only after people were coming back from the Iraq War with injuries that they would never survived before in the past that overwhelmed our healthcare system. But just so it's pretty ironic that the one socialized system in our country is to take care of the people that defend our freedoms. There's some irony in that. So with regard to letting the free market rule, believe it or not, there are only two industries that are exempt from antitrust legislation: Major League Baseball and the health insurance industry. But there's been such heavy consolidation over the last several years that it's hard to say that there's a free market. In most markets, one or two insurers generally control the top 94 metropolitan areas in the United States. And this is just showing you one of the things you always hear about: freedom, freedom, freedom. Well, the Heritage Foundation, which is a very conservative think tank, every year comes out with their economic freedom score. And if you look, every country that's ranked above the United States has universal health care. So it hasn't interfered. If anything, it's unleashed a lot of productivity because their businesses don't have to cover healthcare costs for their workers. So this again, as far as individual freedom, we don't have any. In California, the last six largest insurers have had 45.7 million denials in the last 9 years in California alone. So that means every time you try to go get a prescription filled, or your doctor writes you a script, or you try to go see a doctor, there have been denials. So whenever people would say, don't let the government come between you and your patient, I tell people the insurance industry is constantly becoming between us and our patients day after day after day, or you or your doctors. They're telling you what hospitals you can go to, what drugs you can take. So the idea of an individual freedom, it just doesn't exist. This is just showing you that in California, between 2002 and 2011, premiums in the state of California have got up 153%, during which time inflation has only gone up 29%, and wages have remained relatively stagnant. Yet, if you look at the salaries of the CEOs of these insurance companies, they've had banner years, as much as $30 million in a year, whereas the average worker in 2013 was only making $35,000 in the United States. And what do they do with the money? So they take the money and they use it to lobby Congress. This is just showing you the amount that was run in the run-up to the ACA. And this is what's happened. So it looks like at the time of the legislation, there were 3,300 registered healthcare lobbyists for the 535 members of Congress, roughly 6 lobbyists for 1 member of Congress. They spent more than $1.2 million a day, and that's why the Affordable Care Act, in large part, looks like it was written by the health insurance industry. So much so, The Lancet, which is a very reputable medical journal published in England, took the time to do a special edition on the dysfunction of our legislative ability to pass health care. And they said the healthcare reform process exposes how corporate influences renders the U.S. government incapable of making policy on the basis of evidence in the public interest. The fact that one of the most respected medical journals took a whole issue to point this out says something about our system. So what did we get? The individual mandate was actually proposed by Richard Nixon in 1971 as sort of a counter to Senator Ted Kennedy's plan for national health insurance. It essentially is not welfare for individuals, but it's a corporate welfare program. $475 billion is given, our taxpayer money, is given to people who don't have insurance to go buy private insurance from an industry that only makes money by denying care. This is corporate welfare. This is not socialized medicine. So if you look, the health insurance industry has done quite well since the Affordable Care Act. The United Health Group went up 263% since Obamacare became law. United Healthcare was up 33% in 2013, while 0.50% you can see. And this past year, stock prices have hit an all-time high, especially once the Supreme Court rejected the Burwell claim. And one of the things you heard was this is going to be a job killer. Well, look at what's happened to employment in the United States ever since the Affordable Care Act was placed. It's a pretty bad job killer. But for all the good things that the Affordable Care Act did, as far as reducing the uninsured to the lowest it's been in many, many years, and doing away with pre-existing conditions, allowing people under the age of 26 to stay on their parents' health insurance plans, there have been some good things. But the fact are 29 million people are still uninsured in 2016, so which is way too many. Some of them are because the one place where Republicans and Democrats could agree was to exclude our undocumented brothers and sisters, but the other one is in the states where governors have refused to expand Medicaid. And then there are those that are just simply can't afford, fall through the cracks, and it's just too expensive for them. They're above 400% of the poverty line, but they can't afford the high premiums for insurance. So the inconvenient truth is that the average family premium is about $16,000 in the US each year, and it's continuously rising. 36% of people with insurance in the US last year denied seeking care because they couldn't afford the copays and deductibles. 35% of the people who actually get sick and see a doctor cannot pay their medical bills, and there was no provisions in the Affordable Care Act to regulate excessive insurance premiums or allow for negotiation of drug prices. And this is just showing you that that every year, depending on the type of, the premiums continue to climb, some upwards of 20% a year, and in 2016 and 2015, that the different plans are becoming more and more unaffordable for people to buy. This is just showing you what the average deductible is for the various plans, and I would point out the bronze plan is really not insurance. It's the biggest con game that's out there, because the average person who buys the bronze insurance plan, probably between the premium support they get from the government, barely can afford to make the monthly payments, and then I don't think they're going to have $5,000 sitting around in their pocket to cover their medical expenses. So as a result, they delay seeking care. The other thing that you'll see is that while the premiums have continued to rise, so has the amount that the average worker has been able to contribute, 24%. More and more each year. I'm sure many of you were asked to pay more of your premiums in your work sponsored. And it's because, you know, prior to the bailout, General Motors was spending more on insurance for its employees than steel to make cars. And that's a big problem for employers too. I think it's really difficult to continually ask our employers to cover everybody, but this is the nature of our healthcare system. And in California, so it's unsustainable for individuals, it's unsustainable in our state. California has over $150 billion in unfunded healthcare debt. So this is a ticking time bomb for individuals in terms of ability to pay copays and deductibles. For our state, mandatory federal health spending is going to go up, continue to go up. So for our country. So I would ask, we're spending so much and getting so little, and why? And this was the slide that Ali pointed out earlier, but if you look, and roughly in 1985 was when you started to have an explosive growth of administrators, and if you look at the percent of GDP curves, we were pretty much comparable with every industrialized nation until 1985. And then in 1985, our costs started to expand, and that's when insurance companies started to look for ways to maximize cost, and the only way you could do that was to hire people to go through every charge and every benefit and deny, and this is what's happened. So we spend, it's estimated we waste about $475 billion a year on non-patient costs, like administrative overhead, sales, marketing, lobbying, billing, underwriting, and compensation. Matter of fact, this is again just showing you that the average physician spends about $83,000 to hire somebody just so that they can fight with insurance companies so they can get paid. Pretty unfortunate. And then on top of that, we have the least efficient healthcare system. So this is the percent of patients who reported spending a lot of time on paperwork or disputes related to their medical bills. We're significantly higher than Switzerland, which I laid up is probably the closest healthcare system to us of all the industrialized nations. They have a very, they private insurers, but they're, quote, not-for-profit, but they also do a lot of the tricks that our insurance companies do. So it's estimated we waste in total about $750 billion a year on healthcare spending, which during the sequester was about the same amount we were spending on national defense. So the Thomas Edison always said, if there's a better way to do it, find it. And I will point out to 1965, that was the year I was born, to me and my dad. But it was also when Lyndon Johnson signed into law Medicare. And as you heard, it was established in 1965 when 44% of adults over the age of 65 were uninsured and 1/3 were living in poverty. Since that time, Medicare has proven to be much more, had higher patient satisfaction, better access to care, and fewer billing problems. The Kaiser Family Foundation found that it was generally more efficient. And this is just showing you the characteristics of the average Medicare person. They tend to be older, have more chronic conditions, have much more drugs requirements and things, and despite caring for a sicker, unhealthy population, the real cost per beneficiary for Medicare has grown much more slowly than the private insurance industry. The other thing is that Medicare is a single-payer system, that we spend roughly about 2% on administrative costs. There's no pre-authorization, there's no, patients have greater choice. The government doesn't tell doctors how to practice, what tests to order, what medications to prescribe. Now, back in 1995, you saw the privatization of our healthcare system when the Republican Congress at that point said that if we place more people into private Medicare HMOs, we're going to end up saving $270 billion over the next 7 years. But in reality, they've overpaid $282 billion during that time. So it's a $550 billion swing. This is also just showing you that the average Medicare HMO, their overhead versus traditional Medicare. And then this is Medicare Part D, which I just want to point out. Billy Townsend, when he got this passed, did point out that they were going to hire a private administrator to manage this. And you can see Medicare Part D, the administrative costs are much higher. And Medicare, through this bill, was prohibited from importing cheaper drugs or negotiating drug prices. And I would say when United Healthcare or these large insurers, Kaiser, uses its market share to negotiate prices, that's considered to be free market good business. But God forbid if Medicare tries to do it in socialized medicine, right? So this is the issue, and as a result, drug prices are much higher. So the best way to strengthen and preserve Medicare, you hear everyone saying Medicare is going broke. Well, if Congress didn't continually undermine it with these corporate welfare programs, it would actually be more solvent than what it is. But if we acknowledge and identify those areas of waste, Medicare Part D, Medicare Advantage plans, and we eliminate these, we could actually provide more financial solvency to Medicare. We also could allow everyone to buy into Medicare, so sort of a robust public option. We could allow young individuals, 26-year-olds, to buy into Medicare and increase the risk pool and ultimately bring a cash infusion in, operate it more efficiently, and instead of those profits going to satisfy shareholders, that would be reinvested into our healthcare system. It would bring a younger, healthier pool and ultimately lead to improved degree of care and benefits for everyone. So why do I think single payer eventually is inevitable? Healthcare costs, as I pointed out, will continue to climb for the individual, for the state, for the federal government. Pretty soon ideology will be eventually replaced by the reality once a critical mass of people learn more about what's happening. We already pay 62% of every healthcare dollar in the United States, as I pointed out earlier. What I mean by that is not only for Medicare, Medicaid, S-CHIP, but all the tax breaks that we give businesses to provide healthcare for their employees. Collectively, that's 62% of every dollar that's spent comes from our own pockets. So we're almost paying for a single payer plan, we're just not getting it. And I will say this, finally, we are getting single payer. Whether or not it's going to be through massive mergers and consolidation, here you see these big groups. Right now we're going to have 3 big insurance companies left in the United States if all these mergers go through. So we're getting single payer. A lot of these insurers recognize the cost savings and the efficiencies of a single payer system. So the question I will end this with is, we're going to get it. Do you want a for-profit industry that only makes money by denying care running it, or do you want Medicare for all? So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Song. Thank you so much, Dr. Rao and Dr. Redkar. All 3 of you have background in, I wanted to take the opportunity to ask you first, how much does it cost? How much does it cost to develop a truly new novel drug and then bring it to market for patients? I hate to call them consumers because I don't want to adopt that language that a patient is a consumer. But just for the sake of our conversation, still call them patients. How much does the drug cost?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer, but because it takes into account the cost for failures of drugs. And that's why you see $1 billion to develop a drug, and now it has gone even 1.8 or 2.5 billion dollars. Also, over the years, we have technology and innovation has gotten good drugs approved. So obviously the next drug to be approved, like in the antibiotics, what we are facing right now, it's very hard to get a new antibiotic approved because they're already at 90%, at least the first effect is pretty large. So if you just take, so 1.5 to 2 billion is the current price tag. If you just take total drugs approved and the total cost that is the price tag to develop the drugs.
And the thing is, it takes by an average of, I think, 12 to 13 years to do so. And I think we have to walk the fine line, right? So on one hand, you want to not do anything to stifle innovation, but companies really like his and smaller companies, they're the ones that are doing the cutting edge, that are raising the money, doing sacrifice. The big companies, particularly the ones that are now inverting and going overseas, and like Pfizer and things, they're not doing any innovation anymore. They are purely marketing companies that are sitting on huge amounts of cash. Before, if you had a discovery in the lab, you cured something in planaria or some crazy thing, you would have a big pharmaceutical company throw lots of money at you, and they'd lock you up now. Now they want to see you get to at least phase 2, maybe phase 1B, phase 2 trials, before they'll even do it. So companies like his are assuming much more risk, and they're really the ones that are putting it out there. But in the end, because it is so expensive, there are a lot of deals that you have to sometimes make with the big pharmaceutical companies, who again are not pharmaceutical companies anymore, they're marketing companies. The problem I would also point out is that the biggest companies, they've had tremendous consolidation as well, and tremendous mergers. So they're trying to constantly increase their revenue, but it's difficult. And then you've got companies like Valiant that just raised the end-of-life drug, 3,000% or something. So there are good companies that really want to do things the right way and realize that we can make a difference. But then there are a lot of companies that are just immoral, purely for profit, and their CEOs make no qualms acting that way.
That's why we need the Elfin Work Center for responsible business, so that business can make a living, but not a killing. How much of the research in drug development or device development comes from taxpayer, NIH, universities, public institutions that provide that new ideas in science?
Tremendous amount. I mean, you mentioned about the Bayh-Dole Act, right? That was what changed the whole thing, where university technology centers have become so esoteric, involved, and now even the doctors are able to take their inventions, like MD Anderson, I know 25% they could have royalty income on so there are a lot of financial incentives also for the researchers to form companies. And a lot of money comes from NIH funding and CI funding in cancer. So yes, a tremendous amount.
What does this financial incentive do to innovation and to the cost of the medication, and finally to the patient who can or cannot afford it?
Again, this is my perspective. I think US is about innovation. So that all is fine. That is not where the issue is. As Dr. Song very rightly said, is you have a lot of small companies, and if you look at what advancement is made by the smaller companies, like Vertex got the cystic fibrosis. They're a mid-tier company, but let's say Gilead's drug. They are charging $85,000. They took 3 years to develop it. They bought it from Pharmacet. They didn't invent the drug. Pharmacet was a small company of 5 people, 10 people, 15 people. So yes, there may be some examples that the large companies did, but a lot of them are from small companies. Where did they get the drug? Probably licensed from a university, or worked with the physician that actually was working at the bench research in developing that particular target. So that should go on. I think It's the later part where the regulatory hurdle for getting something approved has also tremendously increased. FDA is open to discussing with you, but the regulations from a safety perspective, especially non-oncology indications, has tremendously gone up.
I want to add a comment to that. The irony, and I'm sure Paul you'll appreciate, is that the U.S. taxpayers are funding this basic research. And then when it finally results in a beneficial drug, it's the other countries that are getting a subsidized price for it, or lower price for it. And we are, again, paying a higher price for it.
So, I'm sorry, go
Oh,
ahead.
and I will just add that one of the things that they both touched on in their talk was the drug development is going to change. So the technology. So prime example, right now the average is let's say 1.8 billion in 12 to 13 years to develop a drug. Part of it is because it's kind of like we throw something on a wall and see what sticks. What's happening now with the ability to do much more precise precision medicine, prime example is this lung cancer mutation they found. They were able to come up with a drug right away for that mutation, and it got approved in, 3 years, right? For a fraction of the cost. And I think you're going to see technology really greatly bring down the cost of drug development and the time, and you're going to see much more profound effects. So the other thing I thought, which I loved, is that there are too many drugs approved that don't provide any marginal benefit. That maybe 2 weeks survival, a month survival, or some decrease in pain with no cancer survival, and yet that drug gets approved and it gets put out on the market for a huge amount of money. I love that.
So,
yeah.
can I add to that? So the reason that's so insidious is the reason that new drug, the Me Too drug, is put out there is because it starts a new clock ticking on the patent protection. So let's be clear, that's the reason it's there. It's not because they can't innovate. It's that for a very marginal cost on innovation, they're buying another 17 years on the patent.
Which
Keeps the Generics Act.
Yeah,
Keeps the Generics Act.
the Hatch-Waxman Act allowed them to do. Dr. Marsha Angel, in her book, The Truth About the Drug Companies, I quote her frequently. She talks about, in 2002, there were about 78 drugs that FDA patented. There was only 7 out of these 78 drugs that were truly novel drugs. They were not Me Too drugs. They were new molecules for
both Senator Sanders and Hillary Clinton have agreed on is that for the top big biotech companies or pharma companies, they spend more on marketing than they do on R&D, and they get a tax, and that's tax-free. I mean, it's tax deductible. So they're trying to remove the tax deductibleness of their advertising budget. But yeah,
and I raise this point as to why do we allow consumer advertising of prescription drugs? Japan, I was with Oscar. It's only the disease that is advertised. So let's say somebody doesn't know NASH. I didn't know when it came out. A non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. Well, you can advertise. Say, see the doctor. Done. No drug, nothing. But we don't. We have butterflies and a lot of visual things where you know that that's not right.
The patient didn't have leg cramps at night until the commercials came.
Exactly.
And everybody came over and said,
Yeah.
That's true. I think I want to follow up on something that we started talking about. I think that innovation pipeline, from where I'm sitting, is very robust. And I also think that, especially in a lot of the innovation space, that we don't have the national boundaries that we have. So I work for time in Canada, and as many Canadian companies end up in Silicon Valley as vice versa. So it's not entirely that type of boundaries, and certainly pharma is a global business. No major pharma companies in one country. So in some sense, I don't know what the numbers are in terms of how much U.S. taxpayers subsidize relative to what other taxpayers subsidize. But I certainly know that in terms of the benefits we get, we're getting the right end of the deal. So that's for sure. The other point I want to make is that when it comes to innovation, it isn't just about better drugs or better devices. It's also innovating the financial model. And so a company like Castlight, which I'm not saying it's the best one, but it's one of those out there, but it's in a class of technologies that are going to empower consumers more. And similarly, if we could have more data that comes out that shows some, I don't know where you got your slides from, Paul, I'm sure they're published, but if people could have access to that information, I think there will hopefully be a change in posture.
Anyone who wants the slides, you can have them, by the way. So.
Yeah, and transparency. I sometimes wonder, okay, Gilead price was $84,000 the first time that the bill came out. They could have just published, okay, here's why. Here's the research we did to price it this way. They did something. I was in a pharmaceutical company. I was not in the commercial, but I was in the pricing department. But there is something that comes up, and there is a logic to it. And if they published it, there would be a transparency. We don't have that at all.
Yeah.
What model gave them the $84,000 price tag?
It's what they could get away with.
Yeah.
And I will say that we've kind of gone out of our way to really just demonize the insurance industry and the pharmaceutical industry, but providers, as a physician, we have a big role of guilt in this, as do hospitals. I will say, one of the reasons I left Cedars-Sinai was I got tired of the fact that every quarter I would get a report of how much I underbilled. And somebody was paying attention to my utilization and saying, why didn't I maximize here and there? And talk about lack of transparency. You don't know what they charge patients when you go in, and you don't have the luxury of negotiating a price before. If you've got a ruptured appendix or need a bypass, you can't say, well, I'm going to hold out for a different price. You just go in. And so hospital, every part of this has its own culpability in it. I don't mean to just say the insured, but because of the amount that they take out for how little they provide. I think that's why I really highlighted that. But I think the fee-for-service system for medicine is absolutely broken. It incentivizes you to do more, not less, and not better, although that's going to change now. But doctors have a big role in breaking the system, as do hospitals. So
I have to add to that. It takes several parts of a society for a failure to actually completely occur. Our media did not educate us about the real facts about healthcare, and our professional organizations also did not look after the ethos of the profession, nor the benefits of the patient. Several years ago, I paid $25 to American Medical Association, and I still regret it. So I want my money back. We have a few more minutes left. I wanted to ask if anybody in the audience has any questions so that we could continue to stimulate the conversation.
Please use this mic. Yeah.
But if we have disclosure rules on the back of cereal boxes and can of Coke, or if we have disclosure rules on our mortgages, which are now written in clear black letters, which almost anybody can understand, what would it be like to apply the same principles through the value chain in the medical system, such that consumers, when they interacted with it, would get a very clear statement of, for example, what the cost is of this particular insurance company in the last 5 years, or whatever it might be?
So I know with regard to hospital pricing, that the state of Maryland actually passed something along those lines, and it dramatically leveled costs. In California, there have been a couple attempts at trying to get...
That's the reason why then there's price competition, there's price erosion depending on the number of people, number of players that are in it, and then the price accordingly changes. That's the reason for the price change. And you're exactly right, is a lot of the generics, almost 85%, are coming from outside US. And then the price erosion goes down to a point at which that manufacturer also says that I'm not making any money, or Medicare has a $10 a vial, I'm not making money on that vial, I'm going to stop making the product. And then the patient does not get the product at all, because now you're dependent on the supply from a manufacturer outside of the country.
I will also say, with regard to generics, you're seeing a lot of consolidation in that field as well. Like Teva is a huge pharmaceutical company now that used to just do generics, and now they're doing their own brand new drugs. So a lot of generic drugs are not as cheap as they used to be. I'm shocked to see the price of some generics recently. That you used to think that it was a huge cost savings, but it's become its own booming market. So it's almost like become between Coke and Pepsi now, that one's just slightly cheaper.
And another interesting, if I may add, for the biologics, remember biologics have had a great run, the Genentechs, the Amgen, they've not had quote-unquote generics, or now they're called biosimilars. For the first time, US has approved a couple of biosimilars. You're going to see that price erosion, but now the pharma companies are coming up with their own biosimilars. So they have the branded, they're coming up with their own biosimilar, and so that they have an ability on keeping the price high. So a lot of pricing strategies, which I'm also not really aware of in the biologics industries.
Now, regard to the TPP, I mean, it looks like unfortunately that's going to be adopted, and that is one of the provisions in that it does make patent protection much longer than what currently exists. And another piece of legislation that really was written by industry rather than sadly.
Business of medicine. In my private practice, I was impressed by the amount of fragmentation in medical care. And we talk about multiple payers and fee-for-service. You know, particularly in this area, there's another model, Kaiser, where the physicians are employed. You have the same person providing hospital care, outpatient care, radiology, drug, nursing care, physical, the whole thing. How do some of these figures about the cost of medical care apply to Kaiser?
So I will say that Kaiser is probably the closest model of if you belong to Kaiser, it's a single payer system, right? Every aspect of that. But yet their premiums have gone up as much every year as any other insurer in the state of California. So if they have cost savings, and they're supposedly a not-for-profit, but they're sitting on, last I heard, 2,000 times what they're mandated by the Department of Managed Care to have in terms of reserves. Somewhere around $9 billion or something in reserves, maybe more. So they're realizing efficiencies. Whether or not that's trickling down to their customers, it's hard to say. My father-in-law belongs to Kaiser. He has been diagnosed with AFib, and they've got him on the cheapest drugs. They don't have him on. He's on Coumadin, right? He's got to go get his blood checked every week. It's a pain in the ass for us to drive him there every day. Versus somebody else I know takes the one at a time because it's not fragmented. There is more coordination of care. So there are a lot of benefits to what Kaiser has. It's just I'm not sure the cost savings ever trickle down. Like when the CalSTRS or the big unions contract out to Kaiser, their rates are still going up as much as Blue Cross or any of the other plans. So on one hand, they claim to be more efficient, but we wouldn't know because they're still charging the same amount of premiums every year.
And I got involved with the healthcare issue because I was working with asthma patients that could not afford their steroid inhalers. So I had to get them into patient assistance programs and spend a lot of time on paperwork just to keep their inhalers coming. So that was like 20 years ago, and we're still working on it. But one thing I'd like to suggest is that people follow, for instance, the health industry on the stock market. Right now, the total market cap is about $1 trillion, and the pharmaceutical companies are right at the top of the list. And the other thing to follow is maplight.org has the health industry campaign finance money. All you have to do is Google Maplight and health, and it'll come up with all your civil servants and how much they're receiving from the health industry. A question from the panel. How much does investor returns play into the cost of health care in this country? And is there anything we can do about it in terms of like a very small stock transaction tax on capital gains and or dividend income?
First of all, I love the nurses, and so the national nurses have this Robin Hood's tax that is really designed to tax speculation, tax stock purchases, and use those proceeds to pay for college. But that's a whole other issue. I'll speak just to the health insurance side. I'll allow that others to speak on the pharmaceutical side. When you have to satisfy certain growth year after year after year, returns to keep your shareholders happy, to keep your stock price high. Initially, when these companies started, they were able to extract a lot of savings, right? Because there was a lot of inefficiency in healthcare. So they moved to managed care, they moved to really much more utilization review. And in the initial, that was good because probably there were a lot of tests that were being ordered that shouldn't have been. There were a lot of drugs that were being prescribed that maybe shouldn't have been. But after a while, once you trim all the fat off, there's no more fat to cut, right? So how do they then make up they cut reimbursements to hospitals and doctors and pharmaceutical companies, but then they also jack up premiums. And so that plays a large part. When you look at the cost of living increases that most people get through work, or the average rate of inflation in the US, and then you look at health insurance premiums going up, like certain plans in the state of California went up 39% last year. You know, where's that money going? It's not, you know, part of that is because they have to meet return after return after return.